Welcome to EPG Padshala. My name is Dr. Mala Pandrang and I am a professor at Dr. BMN College of Home Science affiliated to SNDT Women's University. I will be walking you through the module on identity, gender construction and sexuality. This module is offered under the paper of Sociology of the Indian Diaspora. In this module, we will be looking at 4 important aspects. First, we will examine the characteristics of the Indian diaspora, which you have already had a look at in the introductory module to the Sociology of the Indian Diaspora. This is a very important aspect if we are to understand how identity processes take place when migration occurs. The notion of identity is crucial to understanding what is diasporic subjectivity. We will therefore spend time in trying to understand this complex notion. Once we have looked at the notion of diasporic subjectivity, we will then go on to examine the very interesting aspect of what happens to women when they migrate. An interesting entry point of understanding what happens to women when they migrate is to try to look at narratives by Indian women. We will therefore look at some very interesting novels and also production of films and try to relate these to different phases of the Indian diaspora. In the last section, we will touch upon the element of construction of sexuality and try to examine how across temporal and spatial constructs the whole element of sexuality has been presented through these narratives. Now, in a diasporic relationship, the migrant moves between 2 locations. She leaves the sending society, which we can refer to as point of departure, and arrives at the receiving society, or what we can call the location of arrival. The migratory process involves not just the journey of the individual, but that of a collective of a people from the homeland to the hostland. Therefore, let us remember that one of the fundamental characteristics of the diasporic experience is the movement of communities and not just individuals across ethno-cultural and cartographic borders. Over time, this results in the formation of a diasporic space which goes beyond mere geo-territorial terms of referencing. This space has been referred to as a third space. One of the defining characteristics of the diasporic community is that while its members may have moved away from the homeland, the community still maintains a strong connection with the mother culture and retains bonds through kinship networks, food habits, clothes, language, music and films. These connectors are referred to as spatial connectors. The community strives to retain a collective memory or myth about their original homeland. The extent of bonding with the actual homeland is predicated upon the reception to the diaspora by the host land. Therefore, what happens is that there is a separation from the mother culture, and this results in experiences of trauma, memory and loss. Hence, in theoretical discussions of the diasporic experience, we come across descriptive terms such as displacement, dislocation and disease. In the course of this migration process, the subject experiences complex cross-cultural negotiations. This in turn impacts on the notion of the self. The notion of the diasporic subjectivity thus derives from the assumption when you are dislocated from one specific cultural milieu, let us take the Indian subcontinent for instance, and relocate it to another, say Canada or United Kingdom. This can result in shifts in identity construction and transitions of psychological state of being. This in turn leads to a sense of ambivalence and what has been referred to as unbelonging. This sense of ambiguity is an inherent aspect of what we refer to as a diasporic subjectivity. Now, varied processes of acculturation can lead in complex of evolving identities. The degree of displacement or sense of loss will of course vary from individual to individual and depend upon specific contexts. On arrival, Indian migrants have learned to adapt and negotiate their way through new lifestyles. In doing so, they experience a range of new emotional experiences. We can therefore state that the act of migration not only entails a shifting from one geocultural location to another, but also a shift in the consciousness or mind view. As Vijay Agnew explains, and I quote, "The individual living in the diaspora experiences a dynamic tension every day between living here and remembering there, between memories of place or origin and entanglements with places of residence, and between the metaphorical and physical home." Unquote. An understanding of the formulation of this double consciousness is crucial to any investigation of the diasporic subjectivity. The diaspora continues to relate to the homeland in one way or another, and yet on contact with the receiving society, there is bound to be an inevitable cross-pollination of multicultural practices. Children of the first generation migrants gradually come to identify with their new homeland as they experience multiple processes of assimilation. The ethno-communal consciousness of second generation migrants increasingly becomes defined by the idea of the hyphen, with terms of reference emerging such as British Asian, American Indian, East African Asian, etc. The issue of generational change in identities and relationships with the homeland is, however, a complicated one. There is an interesting study by Karen Isken-Leonard where she points out to the limitations in theories about diaspora when applied to descendants of first generation immigrants. She has studied the Hyderabadi diaspora and contends that there will be a basic difference in consciousness between first generation migrants and their children. She explains that while parents might think of their children as South Asian heirs to an identity that was an extension in space, their children, having been raised abroad, do not necessarily share the same nostalgia associated with the ancestral world. This is an interesting point which we must ponder upon. In an important essay called Cultural Identity and Diaspora, Stuart Hall discusses issues of diasporic hybridity and difference with reference to the Afro-Caribbean cultural identities. According to Hall, and I quote, "Diaspora identities are those which are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference." Unquote. It would be interesting for you to have a look at Hall's insightful analysis of cultural identities and underlying complexities and practices, and try to apply these to the contexts of the Indian diaspora. A third analytical term used by cultural theorists is that of hybridity, which in the context of diaspora refers to a culturally mixed identity. The individual is caught between multiple forces of assimilation on one hand and the pull of roots on the other. It is this process of hybridization that creates a liminal space of in-betweenness, a space where identity is constantly negotiated and almost always in the process of becoming. This is a space where migrants express their dilemma in being caught between loyalty to the home culture and that of the new culture through different modes of creativity. Now let us examine how cultural production by diasporics offer an interesting insight into formation of identity processes. There are several films, novels and other forms of creative output available by persons of Indian origin. Let us take up two novels here, Jhumpa Lahari's The Namesake and Monica Ali's Brick Lane, to examine how the authors explore the complex range of experiences involved when their protagonists cross boundaries of ethnicity, race, language and culture. This experience is often accompanied by resultant clashes, both personal and familial. Since both these novels are film adaptations, you may want to explore both the novel and the film to see how dislocation impacts on perception of self and other, and how the protagonists negotiate contradictory sides of being and becoming. The second generation characters find themselves in a position of in-betweenness, belonging neither here nor there, and have to negotiate their sense of being. We now come to the section on gender constructions. Here we will explore the gendered impact of migration on communities of Indian women. We will examine how issues of gender, race, sexuality and ethnicity can be used as analytical categories in the study of diaspora identity. The section will offer a few examples wherein these issues are reflected in cultural productions such as diaspora women's writing and film. As viewed earlier in the modules on the history of the Indian diaspora, emigration from the Indian subcontinent is generally categorized according to geographical scope as well as historical periodization. Under the broad-based category of the old Indian diaspora, which took place during the expansion of colonial capitalism, we have the mass mobility of Indian men and women to far-flung colonies of Fiji, Mauritius, Caribbean islands and South Africa, mainly as indentured labor, as well as large number of passenger Indians to East Africa. Here initially the migration was predominantly male with only a few women. Under the category of the new Indian diaspora, there is a wave of migration after the Second World War to the United Kingdom for the purpose of supplying labor to industries, and then the brain drain of white-collar professionals amongst others to the United States post-1960s. These tend to be migration with families. The third wave of movement has been the most recent, large-scale mobility of contract labor to Gulf countries in West Asia. This migration is generally not with families. In most cases, it is only by males, and only in a few occupations like nursing and domestic labor, it is female-only migration. While examining gender, we must take into account the above demography as well as economic and political factors linked to the migration of women. Given the tempo-historical framework of the Indian diaspora and complexity of circumstances of mobility, we cannot generalize about the nature of the migratory experiences. Rather, each movement should be examined in its specific context. The heterogeneous nature of migration has resulted in the production of complex diasporic gendered identities among diverse groups originating from the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, there is neither a singular diaspora experience nor a singular gendered identity. Importantly, we must keep in mind that men and women do not necessarily share the same experience of migration. Especially as far as women migrants are concerned, crucial areas of negotiation include personal choice, with community compulsions and repressed sexuality. The experience of women migrants from the Indian subcontinent have not been adequately discussed under the larger rubric of diaspora studies. It is only in the past 2 or 3 decades that important works have emerged wherein space is being accorded to their experiences. While it is not possible to cover the entire gamut of studies here, we will examine a few examples wherein diasporic scholars have approached issues of gender at the intersection of caste, class and race in the context of a specific reading of migration history. Their research is based on official records and archives as well as non-official sources such as memoirs, oral accounts, photographs and family histories. These scholars raise questions about the impact of diverse experiences on gendered identity formations. Importantly, they also examine the productive and reproductive roles of women in order to locate larger questions of women's agency. They raise important questions on representation of women in studies of the diaspora through their gendered reading of the diasporic experience. Within the traditional fundamentally patriarchal Indian diaspora, gendered identities are regulated by a binary system of man and women. The manner in which Indian women negotiate patriarchal expectations along with modernity and contemporary realities of the adopted land is central to our understanding of the way in which gendered identities are formed. As we observed in section 1, the act of separation or uprooting is governed by tropes of trauma, memory and loss. Women who migrate experience loss in multiple forms. For instance, There is a loss of the natal family and the sense of security that comes from the presence of familiar social linkages. According to Geetanjali Singh Chanda, first generation women migrants are thrice alienated. First, from the country left behind, then from the new host country, and finally from their children. Aparna Rayapol explicates this further in her book Negotiating Identities, Women in the Indian Diaspora, wherein she points out that women from the diaspora are at least thrice marginalized, first as women, then as immigrant women, and also as immigrant women from the third world. And yet, in course of time, as women start to take control of their lives, their identity undergoes a series of changes resulting in a refiguration of the self. It is important to understand how women have to negotiate new cultural experiences, which calls for accommodation with the receiving culture, the degree of which may vary. Varied processes of acculturation in turn result in a complex of evolving identities. Hence, the experience of migration can lead to a complex sense of alienation and ambivalence. We have also studied that one of the core features of the diaspora is the idea of the myth of return and a sense of nostalgia for the past. In this regard, women have played an important role as custodians of culture. For example, the onus on retaining core values is often placed on the woman as wife or mother responsible for raising children in an alien society. She has to tackle with a difficult job of instilling cultural norms of the home culture within the domestic space, thereby ensuring that the family maintains emotional ties with the homeland. And yet she herself is caught within the problematic process of negotiation with spaces beyond the confines of the home. This includes the way she dresses, the language she speaks, and the food she cooks. Clothes also play an important role in how women stand out from the mainstream. Women experience racism when they are perceived as different from the mainstream culture. This could be on the basis of their clothing, their ethnicity, and even the ability to speak English. Let us take the example of dress, which can serve as a class and religious marker. Women are often compelled to retain their ethnic way due to compulsions from patriarchal hierarchy set in place in the receiving society. The example of the banning of the burqa in France is an example of how women migrants are caught in the conflict of religious belief of the community on one hand and demands of the nation state on the other. While many women may see the manner in which they dress as central to their cultural identity, others work out subversive strategies to evolve a liberatory space for themselves. For example, the main protagonist of Ravinder Randava's Harijan is a young British girl who delights in wearing her salwar kameez with a pair of Reeboks. This is an interesting fusion of the tradition with the modern, as also assertion of multiple identities. Narratives of popular culture, such as novels, short stories, and films, are important and interesting sources to understand how a first generation migrant woman has to negotiate constantly with the new culture of the receiving society. A close examination of modes of cultural production can offer a rich insight into how resistance, negotiation, and agency takes place. A large number of migration narratives are based on biographical and autobiographical accounts and offer invaluable insights into the range of cross-cultural experiences and ensuing conflicts. Insights into the range of cross-cultural experiences and ensuing conflicts and dilemmas. Now, as the second generation of women grow up, they are caught between two worlds. They have to deal with the push and pull between nurturing traditional values on the one hand and cope with the values of the dominant culture such as individualism and sexual freedom on the other. This generational conflict is often expressed through discussions on the mother-daughter relationship, which is a common theme in migrant narratives. Preeti Nayar's novel, 100 Shades of White, throws light on the conflicting values between a daughter whose sense of belonging is more towards the United Kingdom where she has grown up. She attempts to negotiate between two worlds. Her mother, on the other hand, has largely remained alienated from the white mainstream culture and this leads to a struggle between the two. An interesting film that you may want to watch is Bend It Like Beckham, which deals with the struggles of Jess, a young girl who is British Asian of Punjabi origin and who dreams of becoming a football player and has to come to terms with her conflicting identities as well as issues of interracial romance. We now come to the final section of the module, the section on sexuality. A recurrent trope during the nationalist period has been the equation of the mother figure with Mother India. This symbolic use of the mother figure was one of the means of projecting the role of the Indian woman in the family in promulgating the notion of a pure wife as the backbone of a heterosexual family. Therefore, figures of mythology such as Sita become central to the representation of values of chastity and obedience. Any challenge to this norm was interpreted as a betrayal of Indian cultural values, and any expression on sexuality was thus silenced. Vidya-mitra, in the literature of the Indian diaspora, theorizing the diasporic imaginary, describes how the epic tales of the Ramayana appeal to first generation migrants because the exile of Rama is characterized by loss and trauma. On the other hand, feminists have challenged the depiction of Sita and her obedience of staying within the limits of the Lakshman Rekha. They point out how the control of a woman's body has been closely related to the community's desire to safeguard its honor or izzat. This leads to questions of repressed sexuality within the community, also impacting upon race and ethnicity within the receiving society. Women have largely been treated as migrant wives. Yet studies on the profile of indentured women point out that a large number of women who set out for the Caribbean islands included beggars, widows, and even prostitutes. It has been interpreted that indenture provided these women with the possibility of escaping severe social strictures, such as the ideology of widowhood and its restrictions. The fact that they were employed meant that they had some level of economic independence. Therefore, in a sense, these women exerted agency by making a conscious decision to risk a journey across the Kalapani in order to escape an oppressive patriarchal system in India. Female migrants who had to survive in a predominantly male setup faced grossly exploitative conditions. You may want to read Coolie Woman, wherein the author Gayatri Bahadur presents the fascinating life narrative of her great-grandmother, who, unlike most of the indentured labourers, was a high caste Hindu. She set sail as a single pregnant woman for Guyana in 1903 as a coolie. Through meticulous research, drawing upon archives and family recollections, Bahadur reconstructs and allows an insight into the hitherto unheard saga of over 250,000 other women, many of whom were widows and social outcasts. We learn of the traumatic conditions of their journey across the Middle Passage and of the hardships they had to endure on arrival. Due to the male-female ratio and the shortage of women as compared to male indentured labourers, these women were sexually exploited both by fellow indentured male labourers as well as colonial overseers. For example, in Guyana, the sex ratio in 1857 was 35 per 100 men, which rose to 50 per 100 men by 1860. The lower wages for women rendered them as doubly marginalized entities within an oppressive system. In Mobilizing India, Women, Music and Migration between India and Trinidad, Tejaswini Niranjana presents a fascinating interdisciplinary study of 19th century travel narratives, film, music, lyrics such as Chutney Soka and Calipo songs in order to build up an argument that the perceptions of Indian female sexuality in Trinidad have long been central to the formation and disruption of dominant narratives of nationhood, modernity and normative sexuality in India. Another very interesting study is Dana Sindenberg's chapter of Women in the East African Asian Community. This is perhaps one of the few studies on the position of women of Indian origin within tightly knit communities which promoted endogamy as a strict norm. She points out that in the case of the diaspora in East Africa as elsewhere, the notion of women's purity went hand in hand with sex segregation and the cult of marriage and domesticity. Women were brought up to think that marriage was the only acceptable option open to them, and the home became the focal point of female reproduction. However, there are many instances wherein women have challenged these norms. Meera Nair's film Mississippi Masala offers an interesting take on how a second generation young Ugandan Asian woman takes her family's racial prejudices head on by falling in love with a black man. Coming to a more contemporary context, Sanjana Santyan makes an important observation of how Bollywood repeatedly presents an essentialist interpretation of diasporic femininity that imagines, and I quote, "the ideal woman adorned in a sari, her forehead dotted with a red bindi and hair pulled back in a plait, beautiful but sexually constrained," unquote. Any violation of the woman's chastity becomes a violation of her honor, which implicates the female in control of her husband or father rather than the woman herself. Satyan analyzes the depiction of females in films such as Pardes, Dilwale Dulhania and Love Aajkal. She argues that such repressions of sexuality mirror real life suppressions of aspects of many women's experiences. However, she also points out that it is important to compare the reality of actual lives of women in the diaspora to those depicted in the narratives and films. There are several young women who define their own spaces. For example, Prema Kurian notes in the results of a sociological study of migrated Indian graduate students that the modern diasporic woman in reality is often quite transgressive and hails from a more progressive family than before. Another important article is that by Ananya Bhattacharjee, wherein she discussed the roots of domestic violence among the middle class Indian American families, which compels its members to conform to the norms of heterosexual and patriarchal families. Activists in locations such as United States and Canada have expressed concern about incidents of sexual violence widely prevalent in the community. You may wish to look at websites of non-profit organizations that provide women caught in the vortex of domestic violence, emotional abuse, sexual assault and family conflict, such as the Asian Family Support Services and Saki. Conventionally, diasporic identities have positioned heterosexuality as the norm and central to the cultural identity of the community. However, in this century, we have interesting timelines on non-heterosexual conforming people of South Asian ancestry available online. From the mid-1980s onwards, support groups are increasingly giving voice to the hitherto silenced voice of gay, lesbian and transgender communities who are coming to terms with themselves and are beginning to challenge the mainstream conventional patriarchal hierarchy. They are also discussing racism encountered from white queer communities. In an article entitled Gay, Lesbian and Bisexual Themes in Diaspora Literature, Emmanuel Nelson shares how writers of the diaspora, born in the Indian subcontinent but who have migrated to the West, have started to express their sexuality with candor. He explains how their personal conflicts and political contradictions are generated by their interacting with ethnocultural, post-colonial and homosexual subjectivities. For further information, you could visit online forums such as www.tricon.org or southasiannetwork.org to gain a sense how the networking among the diasporic communities is helping to forge a global South Asian queer identity. We have come to the conclusion on the model of identities, gender construction and sexuality. I hope that you have found this module interesting and that it has given you sufficient information for you to explore the fascinating area of gender construction as well as the notion of diasporic subjectivity further. We began by looking at salient aspects of the diasporic identity. We examined how diasporic identity has to be negotiated through a whole gamut of complex experiences. We looked at the notion of hyphenated identity as also the sense of unbelongingness and ambivalence which is central to the notion of diasporic subjectivity. We spent considerable time examining the experiences of women as related through narratives on and by women of the Indian diaspora. The very important issue of sexuality within the context of patriarchal structures of the Indian diaspora was also examined. Several suggestions have been given as to reading material as well as cultural narratives which you might want to explore further. I do hope that you go ahead and do so. Thank you.